On January 14, 2024, rescue teams searching the Rocky Mountains made a difficult decision. After 2 days of searching Silver Ridge Trail, they stopped looking. The weather was turning deadly, visibility was gone, and no trace of the missing hiker had been found. Officially, the case was over. Emily Carter was presumed dead. But 3 hours later, something unbelievable happened. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped outside his patrol cabin near Pine Creek and saw a German Shepherd walking out of the forest. The dog was moving slowly, carefully, like it was carrying something fragile, and it was. Across the dog's back was Emily Carter, alive, barely breathing. But here's what no one could explain: the search dog that saved her life was not assigned to a rescue anymore. There was no active search command, no handler with him, which meant that somehow the dog had returned to the mountain alone. But when investigators later checked a hidden camera near the trail, they discovered something chilling. Because Rex was not the first one to find her. Someone else had already been there, and they walked away. Stay with us because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. It was January 2015 in the afternoon, and the temperature outside the patrol cabin on Ridge Trail Road had dropped to levels that made the air feel like it could crack glass. Officer Daniel Brooks had been stationed near Pine Creek, Montana, for 3 years, and he knew these mountains the way most men knew the streets outside their own homes. He had seen storms roll in without warning, watched trails disappear under 6 feet of snow overnight, and responded to more emergencies than he cared to count. But nothing in those 3 years had prepared him for what he saw the moment he stepped outside that cabin door to check the perimeter. He stopped walking. His boot froze mid-step in the snow. His hand stayed gripped around the door handle as his eyes locked onto the tree line at the far edge of the clearing. A German Shepherd was moving slowly through the deep white expanse, each step labored, each movement deliberate and careful in a way that immediately struck him as wrong. Dogs didn't move like that in the snow. Not unless they were carrying something. Brooks squinted, shielding his eyes against the pale winter light. His chest tightened before his brain had even finished processing what his eyes were showing him. The dog was carrying a woman. She was draped across the animal's back, unconscious, her arms hanging down on either side, her body limp and unmoving. Brooks stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds before his training kicked in and sent him sprinting forward through the snow. The woman's face, turned sideways against the dog's fur, was pale as the landscape around her. He would later learn her name was Emily Carter, a 31-year-old hiking guide from Missoula who had been reported missing 2 days earlier. Search and rescue teams had combed these mountains for 48 hours straight, but at 8 that morning, with a fresh storm threatening and no trace of her found, the search had been officially called off. The teams had packed their equipment, loaded their vehicles, and driven back down the mountain. They had accepted the worst. And yet here she was, alive, being carried out of the wilderness by a dog that, by every official record, should not have been anywhere near these mountains anymore. 3 hours earlier, at approximately 1:30 that morning, Emily had been making her way along the Silver Ridge Trail when a patch of black ice beneath a fresh dusting of snow gave way under her left foot. She went down hard and fast, sliding 20 feet down an icy slope before a cluster of frozen pine roots stopped her fall. Her left leg had twisted badly in the fall, and the pain that hit her when she tried to stand told her immediately that something was broken. Her phone showed no signal. She screamed until her throat gave out, but the mountains swallowed every sound she made without returning so much as an echo. She pressed herself against the slope, wrapped her arms around her chest, and whispered for anyone to help her. The forest stayed silent. Then, at 11:15, a sound broke through the cold. A bark, not distant, not uncertain, close, sharp, and purposeful, through the snow-draped pines. A German Shepherd came pushing toward her with the kind of focused urgency that looked nothing like a lost or wandering animal. Rex had come back. By the time Rex reached Emily's side on that frozen slope, her core temperature had already dropped to a level that made survival a matter of minutes rather than hours. Her fingers had gone beyond numb, past the stage where they ached. into the quiet stillness that search and rescue teams are trained to recognize as the last warning before the body starts shutting down. She could barely lift her head. She could not stand. She could not walk. What she could do was lean. And Rex, a 75-pound German Shepherd who had no active search command, no handler beside him, and no official reason to be on that mountain at all, lowered his body against hers and held steady. Emily said later that she did not fully understand what was happening in those first moments. She understood only that something warm was pressed against her, that she was being nudged, gently but persistently, in a direction away from the slope and toward the trail. Rex moved slowly, adjusting his pace each time Emily faltered, planting himself like an anchor whenever she looked like she might go down completely. They covered nearly 1 mile through snow that in places came up to Emily's waist, and Rex never once stopped pushing her forward. He did not dart ahead and disappear. He did not circle in confusion. He stayed at her side with the calm, patient determination of an animal that understood exactly what the moment required. Officer Brooks saw them when they were still about 300 yards from the cabin, the dog's dark fur cutting a visible line through the white, the woman's bright orange jacket draped across its back like something out of a story no one would believe if they hadn't seen it themselves. He was already on his radio before his feet started moving, calling in an emergency medical response with an urgency in his voice that he hadn't felt in years. He reached them in the clearing, dropping to his knees beside Emily and pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was there. Weak and slow, but there. She stirred faintly at his touch, her eyes moving beneath closed lids. "I've got you," he told her. "You're okay?" Emergency services reached the cabin in under 20 minutes. The paramedics worked fast, wrapping Emily in thermal blankets, getting a line into her arm, loading her onto a stretcher with the kind of efficient urgency that told Brooks everything he needed to know about how close this had been. Rex sat in the snow and watched them work. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He simply sat there with his eyes fixed on Emily until the moment they lifted her into the ambulance. Brooks reached down and placed his hand on the dog's head. Rex didn't react. His gaze stayed on the ambulance doors. Emily arrived at Missoula Medical Center at approximately 20:45 that afternoon. Doctors diagnosed severe hypothermia and a displaced fracture of the left tibia. They worked on her for the better part of an hour before her body temperature stabilized and her vitals climbed back to a range that no longer made the attending physician's jaw tight. At 30:40 p.m., Emily opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was a nurse standing at the foot of her bed with a clipboard. The second thing she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Rex was sitting on the floor beside the bed, his ears forward, his dark eyes fixed on her face as if he had simply been waiting for this exact moment. Emily stared at him for a long time before she spoke. Her voice came out rough and cracked from the cold. "You didn't leave me," she whispered. Rex's tail moved once against the linoleum floor. The staff standing in the doorway exchanged glances with each other and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The search had ended that morning. The teams had left, and a dog had gone back alone and carried a woman out of the mountains. No protocol covered that. No training manual explained it. It had simply happened, and the woman in the bed was alive because of it. Officer Brooks returned to the hospital the following morning with a notepad, a recorder, and a set of questions he already suspected he wouldn't be able to fully answer. Emily was sitting up in bed, her left leg in a cast and an IV still running into her right arm. She looked tired in the deep, bone, level way of someone who had survived something that had come very close to killing them. She told him everything she remembered with the careful, slightly disconnected clarity of a person still processing shock. She described the fall, the cold, the silence that followed, and the moment Rex appeared through the trees. She said she heard his bark at approximately Letterton 15 in the morning, which meant he had found her less than 45 minutes after the official search was called off at 80 Hosers a.m. She said she hadn't fully trusted that he was real at first. She thought she might have been hallucinating from the cold, but he had kept barking until she reached out and touched his fur, and the warmth of him against her frozen fingers had been more convincing than anything she could have said to herself. She described leaning on him, the way he had adjusted his weight each time she shifted hers, The way he had moved when she moved and stopped when she needed to stop. He knew exactly what he was doing, she told Brooks, her voice still slightly rough. He wasn't just a dog wandering around. He had a plan. Brooks wrote everything down and thanked her. Then he drove to the county search and rescue facility and pulled Rex's data. Every working K9 in the Montana Mountain Rescue Program was fitted with a GPS tracking collar that logged movement and recorded whether the animal was operating under an active search command. Brooks plugged Rex's caller ID into the system, scrolled through the morning's data, and felt the back of his neck go cold. Rex had no active command. There was no open search file assigned to him, no handler directive, no official authorization of any kind. The data showed that Rex had been loaded into a transport vehicle at 8:22 a.m. alongside the rest of the K9 unit when the search was called off. But the GPS log showed that at 9:47 a.m. Rex's signal had reappeared on the mountain, 3 miles from where the search teams had departed, moving steadily, without hesitation, in the direction of Silver Ridge Trail. He had gone back alone. Brooks leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen for a long moment. The question that formed in his mind was simple enough, but the answer it demanded was anything but. If Rex had no active search command, no handler, and no official instruction to return to the mountain, then what had brought him back? Dogs didn't make decisions. Dogs followed training, followed commands, followed scent. If Rex had gone back, it was because something on that mountain had called him back. And if that was true, it meant Rex had detected Emily's scent before the search was officially ended. It meant he had known she was there and had been pulled away from her anyway. Brooks closed the laptop slowly. He sat with that thought for a while, and the longer he sat with it, the more uncomfortable it made him feel. The review of the rescue operation began 3 days after Emily was discharged from Missoula Medical Center, and took on a quiet but unmistakable urgency from the moment officials sat down with the timeline. The search had been launched on January 12th, the morning after Emily was reported overdue from a solo hike on Silver Ridge Trail. 22 personnel had participated, including 4 K9 units, 2 aerial teams, and a ground crew of 12. The search had covered the primary trail system and its nearest access points through the night and into the following morning. At 7:45 a.m. on January 14th, with a second major storm system moving in from the northwest and visibility dropping fast, the incident commander made the call to suspend all operations and pull the teams out. It was a defensible decision. The weather data supported it. The search had been thorough by every standard metric. But when investigators laid the GPS data from Rex's collar against the timeline of the search, a pattern emerged that made the room go quiet. Rex's collar showed a significant spike in movement and direction changes at approximately 7:20 a.m., 40 minutes before the search was called off. At that moment, he had been pulling consistently and repeatedly toward a section of the forest that lay approximately 2 miles northeast of his assigned search quadrant. His handler had logged the behavior in the field notes, describing it as agitation, possible fatigue response, possible scent contamination from the storm. He had assumed the dog was confused by the deteriorating conditions and had kept him on a shorter lead to maintain control. Witnesses from the K9 unit confirmed the observation. 2 other handlers recalled seeing Rex straining in the same direction, distinctly different from the unfocused circling a dog typically showed when tired or disoriented. One handler, a 12-year veteran of mountain rescue operations, told investigators that at the time she had thought Rex might be onto something, but had deferred to the incident commander's judgment because the weather was worsening fast, and she hadn't wanted to push the team further into deteriorating conditions with no guarantee of a find. Experts brought in to review the collar data were unambiguous in their assessment. Dr. Karen Albright, a canine behavior specialist with the University of Montana, testified that the directional consistency in Rex's movement pattern was not consistent with fatigue or distraction. A dog pulling toward a specific fixed point with that kind of repetition and intensity, she told the reviewing board, is doing so because it has detected a scent target. That behavior does not occur randomly. It occurs because the scent is there. The implication settled over the room slowly, the way cold settled into a building when a window was left open too long. Rex may have found Emily's scent while the search was still active. He may have been trying to communicate that for the better part of an hour before the teams were pulled out, and when his signal was dismissed as confusion and the search was shut down, he had waited until he was free and gone back on his own to finish what his training and his instinct had started. The incident commander requested a full review of K9 integration protocols in mountain rescue operations. The review was granted, but the findings, when they finally came, raised more questions than they answered. The hearing at Montana District Court in Missoula opened on February 9, 2024, before Judge Patricia Hale, and it drew a room full of people who had followed the story from the moment it broke. The legal question before the court was narrow and procedural on its surface: whether the decision to end the search for Emily Carter had violated established rescue protocols, and whether that decision had exposed the state to liability. But the emotional reality of the hearing was far larger than any procedural question, and it became clear within the first hour that no one in that courtroom was going to be able to keep the two things neatly separated. Emily took the stand mid-morning, dressed plainly, her left leg still in a partial cast, her movements careful and deliberate as she settled into the witness chair. She spoke in a voice that was steady but clearly cost her something to keep that way. She described the hours she had spent on the mountain, the cold, the silence, the desperation of screaming into air that absorbed every sound without sending any of it back. She said that at a certain point, somewhere in the mid-afternoon of the first day, she had heard the distant sound of voices and had screamed until her throat was bleeding and raw. The voices had gotten closer, then farther, then disappeared entirely. She had not known until days later that she had been within earshot of a search team, and that the team had moved in the wrong direction because of a mapping error that placed her coordinates a quarter mile from where she actually was. She said she had heard the sound of helicopter rotors twice on the second day. She said each time they faded away, something inside her faded with them. Her attorney then introduced the video evidence. The footage had been pulled from the K9 unit's field cameras, which recorded continuously during active operations. It showed Rex at 7:22 a.m. on the morning of January 14th, straining forward against his lead with every ounce of force in his body, pulling in the direction of Silver Ridge Trail with the single-minded intensity of an animal that had stopped listening to anything except what its nose was telling it. His handler could be seen on the footage struggling to maintain control, eventually shortening the lead and redirecting the dog. Rex resisted for 11 minutes before the footage cut to the loading sequence as the teams prepared to withdraw. The courtroom watched the footage without a sound. Dr. Albright testified for nearly 2 hours about scent detection behavior in trained K9 units, covering detection ranges, signal consistency, and the behavioral markers that distinguished a genuine scent response from confusion or fatigue. She was thorough and methodical, and when the attorney for the state attempted to suggest alternative explanations for Rex's behavior, she walked through each one and dismissed it with the patience of someone who had spent a long time thinking about exactly these questions. The hearing moved to its third hour before Judge Hale spoke the sentence that changed the temperature of the entire room. She looked up from the evidence summary on the bench in front of her, removed her glasses, and said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the courtroom, "Would Ms. Carter be alive if the dog had obeyed orders?" Nobody answered. The attorney for the state opened his mouth and closed it again. Emily's attorney pressed her pen against her notepad without writing anything. Rex's handler, seated in the gallery, stared at the floor. The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Judge Hale placed her glasses back on and returned to the documents in front of her. She ultimately ordered a mandatory review of mountain rescue guidelines across the state of Montana, with specific attention to K9 protocol and the thresholds required to override a handler's field judgment when an animal displays sustained directional scent behavior. The review was to be completed within 90 days. Emily left the courthouse at 40:20 that afternoon and found Rex waiting outside with his handler, who had brought him at Emily's request. She crossed the steps and crouched down in front of him without saying a word, wrapping both arms around his neck and holding on. Rex pressed his weight against her and held still. The photographer from the Montana Gazette got the shot. It ran on the front page the next morning. Emily had been back in her Missoula apartment for 3 weeks when the envelope arrived, slipped through the mail slot on a Thursday afternoon with no return address, no stamp, and no postmark of any kind. She noticed it the moment she stepped through the front door, a plain white rectangle lying on the mat among the usual stack of forwarded mail and community flyers that had been piling up since her hospital stay. She almost ignored it. She almost set it aside for later and went to make coffee the way she did every afternoon when she got home. But something about the weight of it, or maybe the cleanness of her printed name on the front, made her pick it up and open it standing right there in the doorway. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. On it was a hand-drawn map of Silver Ridge Trail, detailed enough that she recognized the curve of the lower path and the fork where she had turned east on the morning of the accident. There was a red circle drawn in ink, surrounding the area of the slope where she had fallen. Beneath the map, written in neat block letters, were 6 words, "You were never alone there." Emily stood in the doorway for a long time without moving. She read the line 3 times. Then she read it again. The cold that moved through her in that moment had nothing to do with the January air coming through the open door. She stepped back inside and locked it behind her. She sat down at her kitchen table and looked at the letter and thought about what it meant. The search and rescue operation files were not public record. The specific location of her accident, the coordinates of the slope, the section of Silver Ridge Trail where she had been found, none of that information had been released to the media. The map in her hands was precise. Whoever had drawn it knew exactly where she had been. That meant one of 2 things. Whoever sent the letter had either been present during the official investigation or had been on that mountain themselves the morning she was found. She called Officer Brooks at 50:30 that evening. He arrived at her apartment within the hour, and when he looked at the letter, his expression didn't change much. But something behind his eyes went still in the way she had come to associate with him, taking something very seriously. He bagged the letter and the envelope without touching either of them directly. He told her not to discuss it with anyone and that he would look into it. He drove back to the county office that night and sat at his desk with a list of every person who had been given access to the rescue site coordinates and the investigation files. The list was not long. It covered 12 individuals, the incident commander, 3 field supervisors, 4 K-9 handlers, 2 aerial team leads, and 2 investigators from the County Review Board. Every one of them had signed a confidentiality agreement regarding the operational details of the case. Brooks looked at the list for a long time. Then he pulled up the trail access logs for Silver Ridge and started checking entry records against the morning of January 14th. He was going to need to go back to the mountain. Brooks drove back up to Silver Ridge Trail with 2 members of the County Investigations Unit on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after Emily had shown him the letter. The temperature had warmed enough to make the trail passable, but the snow was still deep on either side of the path, and the slope where Emily had fallen was still covered in a thick crust of ice that glittered hard and flat in the morning light. They went over the site methodically, working in a grid pattern the way Brooks had been trained, moving outward from the point where Emily had been found and documenting anything that didn't fit the natural landscape. It was one of the investigators, a quiet, detail-focused woman named Carla Rise, who spotted it first. She had been scanning the tree line above the rescue site when she noticed the small black housing mounted against the bark of a thick pine roughly 20 feet up, angled downward toward the trail at a position that would have given it a clear view of the slope and the surrounding 30 yards. It was a standard wildlife monitoring camera of the kind used by both state forestry services and private hunters throughout the region. Nothing about its exterior was unusual, but its position was exact. It was aimed directly at the spot where Emily had fallen. Brooks called it in and requested a ladder unit. They got the camera down 40 minutes later without disturbing the mount, and Rise popped the memory card in a sealed evidence bag before anyone had said a word about what they were hoping to find. Back at the county office, with the footage loaded onto a secured laptop, they sat down and watched. The timestamp on the recording placed the first relevant sequence at 100 4:47 a.m. on January 14th, which was 17 minutes after Emily's estimated time of the fall. The footage showed the slope clearly, the ice, the deep snow on either side of the trail, and a figure moving slowly along the path from the upper access point. It was a man, heavyset and moving carefully on the icy ground, dressed in dark outdoor gear and a jacket that would only become significant later. He stopped walking when he was approximately 15 feet from the slope. He looked down. He turned his head toward a sound that the camera's audio, grainy and wind-affected, just barely captured a woman's voice, thin with pain and cold, saying the word, "Please." The man on the footage stood still for 11 seconds. Brooks counted them. The man looked in the direction of the voice, looked back up the trail, shifted his weight once, and then continued walking. He did not stop again. He did not turn around. He walked past the slope and kept going until the camera lost him to the tree line. Reyes leaned back in her chair and let out a long, controlled breath. Brooks didn't move. He rewound the footage 17 seconds and watched the moment again. The man had heard Emily. There was no question about that. The audio was clear enough. And he had walked away. Brooks pulled the footage up on a larger monitor and requested an image enhancement on the jacket. It took the tech team 40 minutes to clean up the frame well enough to see what was on the back of the man's coat. When the image sharpened, Brooks felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. The jacket bore the embroidered patch of the Pine Creek Volunteer Mountain Rescue Team. Investigators went through the roster of Pine Creek Volunteer Mountain Rescue Team members the following morning and cross-referenced it against the access logs for Silver Ridge Trail on the morning of January 14th. 2 names appeared on both lists. One of them had a confirmed alibi from 3 other team members who placed him at the staging area below the mountain until 9:30 a.m. The other had signed out of the staging area at 6:15 in the morning, citing a family emergency, and had not been seen by any team member after that point. His name was Gary Tate. He was 53 years old, had been a registered volunteer with the rescue team for 11 years, and had participated in more than 40 active search operations across Lincoln and Missoula counties. His team leader described him as reliable and experienced, someone who knew the mountain trails better than most people who had lived in the area their whole lives. Nobody had questioned his early departure on the morning of January 14th. In the chaos of managing a deteriorating search in worsening weather, a single volunteer signing out early had not triggered any flags. Police located Gary Tate at a hunting supply store in Missoula 4 days later. He did not run when he saw the officers approaching him in the parking lot. He stopped walking and watched them come with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite resignation, but something in between, the look of a man who had been waiting for something for several weeks and had run out of the energy to keep pretending he wasn't. They brought him in and sat him down in an interview room and let him have a cup of coffee before they showed him the footage. He watched it without speaking. He watched it a second time, still without speaking. Then he set down his coffee cup, folded his hands on the table, and told them what had happened. He said he had separated from his assigned search quadrant at approximately 6:40 a.m. to check a section of trail that he knew from personal experience was a common route for hikers who deviated from the marked paths. He was not authorized to be in that area. The section of Silver Ridge Trail where he had been walking fell within a restricted wildlife corridor that required a special permit for access, and volunteers operating under the rescue team's umbrella were explicitly prohibited from entering it without direct authorization from the incident commander. He had entered it anyway, alone, without telling anyone, because he believed it was the most likely place to find the missing hiker. He heard Emily at approximately 10:50 in the morning. He heard her clearly. He recognized immediately that she was alive and injured and that she needed help. And then, he told the investigators in a voice that had gone very flat, he thought about the permit violation. He thought about the liability it would create for him personally. He thought about the fact that he had entered a restricted zone without authorization, and he calculated that if he identified himself as the person who found the missing hiker while operating illegally in a protected wildlife corridor, the legal consequences would land entirely on him. So he kept walking. He told no one. He drove back to Missoula and spent 2 weeks watching the news coverage of Emily's survival and Rex's rescue, and telling himself that it had worked out, that no one had been hurt, that the dog had found her anyway, and everything was fine. He was charged with criminal negligence, and with filing a false record regarding his departure time and location from the search operation.
Emily learned the details about Gary Tate from Officer Brooks on a Friday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she had stopped drinking 20 minutes earlier. Brooks told her plainly and without softening, the way she had asked him to when they had first started talking regularly over the weeks of the investigation. He told her about the footage, about Tate's confession, about the permit violation, about the calculation Tate had made standing 15 feet from the slope while she was crying for help. Emily listened to all of it without interrupting him. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment and looked at her hands and then said, "So Rex was the only one who came back?" Brooks nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "He was." She didn't cry, not in the moment he was there. She was very still in the way of someone absorbing something at a depth that tears can't quite reach yet. What she told Brooks later, when she was processing it more openly, was that the thing she kept returning to wasn't anger at Tate, though the anger was there, and it was real. It was the clarity of the arithmetic. Rex had no permit. Rex had no authorization. Rex had no calculation to make between self-preservation and the sound of a woman's voice. He had simply heard something that needed answering and gone back to answer it. The story broke in the Montana press on February 28th and spread beyond the state faster than anyone in Pine Creek or Missoula had anticipated. National outlets picked it up within 24 hours. The image of Rex and Emily on the courthouse steps ran alongside headlines that ranged from straightforward factual reporting to the kind of emotionally freighted language that people reached for when facts alone didn't seem adequate to carry the full weight of what had happened. The reaction across Montana was immediate and overwhelming. The Pine Creek Volunteer Mountain Rescue Team issued a formal statement expressing their distress at the actions of a registered member and their commitment to reviewing their volunteer oversight procedures. The incident commander who had called off the search was cleared of wrongdoing by the review board, a finding that generated its own wave of public debate. Gary Tate's name became a byword in conversations about institutional cowardice and the human capacity for calculated selfishness in moments that demanded something better. But Rex's name traveled differently. It moved through communities and across social media feeds and into news segments, not as a footnote to a story about failure, but as the story itself, a working dog with no command and no handler who had gone back up a mountain alone because something in him, some combination of training and instinct and whatever it is in a dog that reaches past the edges of both, had refused to stop searching. He became, in the weeks that followed, a symbol that people needed in a way that went beyond Emily Carter's specific survival. He represented something about what loyalty looks like when it is stripped of calculation, about what it means to go back.
The ceremony at the Montana State Capitol in Helena was held on April 22, 2024, on a morning when the sky was the particular sharp blue that the Rocky Mountain region sometimes produced in late spring, the kind of blue that made the surrounding peaks look closer than they were and the air taste clean enough to make you aware of your own breathing. The rotunda had been arranged with folding chairs and a low wooden platform at the center, and by the time the ceremony began at 10 in the morning, every seat was filled, and people were standing 2 deep along the back wall. Governor's aide, Patricia Walsh, spoke first, outlining the events of January 14th with the kind of measured official language that covered facts efficiently while leaving all the texture to be filled in by the people listening, most of whom already knew the story well enough to supply it themselves. Emily spoke second. She stood at the podium without notes, wearing a dark blazer over a pale blue shirt, her left leg fully healed and carrying her weight without any visible accommodation. She spoke for 11 minutes. She talked about the cold and the silence and what it felt like to accept that you might not survive something. She talked about Rex appearing through the trees, and she said the thing she had been trying to find words for since the hospital was, that there was a specific quality to the comfort of realizing that something had come back for you, something that knew what it was doing and had chosen to do it without anyone asking. She said she did not know how to assign the right moral category to that kind of loyalty, whether it was instinct or training or something that sat between the two in a space that the available vocabulary didn't quite cover. She said she knew only that it had saved her life, and that she intended to spend the part of her life that came after it doing something that honored the fact. Governor Brian Schweitzer presented Rex with the Montana State Bravery Award, a distinction that had been given to law enforcement animals 4 times previously in the state's history. Rex sat beside his handler as the medal was clipped to his collar and received the applause of 300 people with the dignified disinterest of a dog who had already decided that what happened in April was considerably less interesting than what had happened in January. Emily reached down and pressed her palm against the side of his neck, and he turned his head toward her hand with the calm, uncomplicated directness that had been the first thing she trusted about him on the mountain. 3 months later, Emily completed her enrollment in the Montana Mountain Search and Rescue Volunteer Training Program. She was one of 14 candidates in her cohort, and one of the few who came to the training with the kind of first-hand understanding of what the program existed to prevent that generally couldn't be taught in a classroom. She passed her first field assessment on Silver Ridge Trail, walking the same route where she had fallen in January, this time in full summer gear with a training pack and a radio and a team of 4 other volunteers beside her. Rex was not officially part of the training cohort, but his handler had brought him along as a working demonstration animal, and he ran the scent exercises with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. And at the end of the session, when the group was resting near the lower trailhead, he sat down next to Emily and stayed there until it was time to leave. The story spread back through Pine Creek in the way that stories do in small communities, not through official channels but through the accumulated weight of people telling each other about it over the following months, in diners and hardware stores and church parking lots, with the additions and emphases that stories naturally collected as they moved from one person to the next. What remained constant in every version, the detail that everyone who told it kept without editing, was the image of the dog coming out of the snow with the woman on his back, moving slowly and steadily toward the cabin, carrying the weight of her survival with a patience and a purpose that no one who saw it could fully explain, and no one who heard about it could quite forget. Sometimes the difference between living and dying was a decision made at the edge of a frozen slope by something that had no capacity for calculation and no awareness of its own courage. Sometimes the difference was a loyal heart that had simply refused to stop searching.